Well, once again, good evening. You get tired of hearing my voice yet? I know I do. No, kidding. So if you have your Bibles with us, we will be picking back up in Genesis chapter 1, because we still are in Genesis chapter 1. We will be picking up at near the beginning of the fourth day, as we last week concluded talking about the second and third days. And we really focused on last week of looking at a lot of the complexity that comes from the speaking of these things into existence, of the order that God brings to each and every day of creation. We started out by talking about the firmament, which in many ways is the atmosphere, the separation between the lower waters, which will eventually become the earth, and the upper waters, which is heaven. And we talked about, the three different types of heavens, and spent some time talking about how exact the atmosphere is essentially concocted, and how those things are so complex just in air that we breathe, that stratosphere, the atmosphere that we have, how exact and precise it is. And then we moved on to the third day, talking about how out from the waters below came the earth, and then the vegetation that began to grow. And what was one of the big things we talked about when it mentions the plants and the trees? There was a phrase that we really emphasized last week. Anyone remember what that is? That was one. After their kind. That was the one I was looking for, but Ian, you are correct. That is one of them, which is that God saw that it was good. And we looked at both phrases. Starting with the after their own kind, we see that there is an order to this system. And it is not confusing that from the very beginning of creation that God emphasizes we're going to create something that's going to be in a system, and it's going to be in an orderly system, and that system is going to be well defined and beyond confusion. You see a strawberry bush, you're not going to wonder if it's going to grow grapes. It will grow strawberries. And we'll talk more about that after their own kind when we get into talking about the animals, hopefully tonight, though I make no promises. But the other thing that Ian brought up, which is that God saw this and it was good. We spent some time talking about last week as well, what is good about it? Why does God say this? That it is well functioning, it is in order, and it is pleasing to Him, and it is perfect. When God says it is good, that means that it is perfectly working in every sense of the word. It is perfect in its design, it's perfect in its functionality, and it's perfect in its continuance. And where we sort of left off last week is talking about the vegetation, moving into there was evening and there was morning in verse 13, a third day, and moving into verse 14, talking about the fourth day. One of the things that we brought up last week before we move into the fourth day, something I want to bring back up again because we really kind of touched on it at the very end of class, and I want to make sure we sort of bring mention to this. Mitch made a comment last week that when we were talking about the firmament, that's just sort of the tip of the iceberg when it comes to the complexity of the things that we see in the earth. One of the things that's really interesting is we look at plants and we think, oh, those are, simple organisms. And those of you that have studied any sort of botany or any sort of land-based biology, whether it was in high school or college, if you can remember back to high school, I'm young so I can, that's just not the case. Plants have a lot of complexity, especially when you look at, say, trees, but even just, the weeds that we are very fond of cutting down when they sprout up. Every plant has a sort of systemic or overall biology, and a lot of it has to do with sort of the way that the cells work and the way that they draw forth energy. They're not a simply put together organism. And plants, trees, they are organisms. They are living. If you ever want to see what a dead plant looks like, leave it in my hands for 2 weeks. It'll be dead. It will no longer be alive. It won't be green anymore. We understand that plant-based organisms are alive. Why are they alive? Well, there's a complex system. There's cells. There's DNA that is transferred. There are male and female parts of plants that pollinate and then are pollinated, and then for many, pollen is spread by bees or the breeze, or you have acorns or lots of trees that drop their seeds onto the ground to create new life. These are not simple systems. These are complicated systems. Just to think of one of the ways that plants sustain themselves, most plants, there's very, very few exceptions, but most plants sustain themselves through a process called photosynthesis. And I'm not a scientist, so this is going to be a very, very broad description, which is essentially plants take in light, they convert light to energy, and then especially trees, breathe out oxygen. I say breathe, but you know what I mean. It's a process through chlorophyll and certain chemicals found within plants, that propagates. Now, what's interesting about having green growing plants on day 3? Anyone kind of see something interesting about that? What's missing? Scott?
No light.
Well, there is light, but I think I heard someone over here say it. There's no sun. There's light, but there's no sun. Now, science will tell us that the sun emits a particular radiation. We're not going to go into all that stuff that we talked about in the first 2 classes. But essentially, it's not really the rays of the sun, but it is the radiation that gives off light that is sort of transferred through photosynthesis. What this tells us is that whatever light, if we're going to look at it literally and not symbolically, we kind of touched on that in the second class, but if we're looking at this literally, as there is light without a sun, that tells us that whatever light was created is exactly the light that the sun was giving off, because we had green plants. We had plant life that was sustained, so whatever light was there that God created on day 1 without the sun, without a star, any star, whatever it was, it held the same properties of light that we experience with the sun. Because we have plants that are growing, that are thriving, that are green, that are alive. You need the process of photosynthesis, which works through the absorbing of light in order to have that. Does that make sense? So it was something that didn't really dawn on me until about my second time really teaching Genesis. I go, oh, it's an interesting little tidbit. Any comments or questions on the 3rd day before we move into the 4th day? All right. Let's see. Don Holland, could I get you to read for me verses, we'll go ahead and do verses 13 through 18, please.
Serve light in the expanse of the heavens to give light on
One more verse, my apologies.
And there was evening and there was morning, the fourth day.
Thank you. All right, so what do we see created on the fourth day, just very broadly? What was that? One more time. Evening and morning, okay. I would argue that we kind of already had day and night, but maybe we could argue that evening and morning were something that is codified in the fourth day because we have something now that can sort of tell us that innately. Anyone else? Mark? Sun, moon, and stars. All right. Very easy to say that, right? Sun, moon, stars. All the stuff that's out there, up there, that we can't really see with the naked eye here on earth. Randall?
We have the sense of time, day and night, so we have the day.
I think that's very much what Lisa was just saying, and I think you two are right on that. Yeah, the sense of time was really created, even though we were having time being tracked by God, saying, we have morning and evening, day one, morning and evening, day two, so on and so forth. Going back to Mark's comment, so sun, moon, and stars. So sun, we kind of already talked about that, the sun being a star. The moon. It's always interesting to me in Genesis, how does Moses, through God through Moses, how does he describe the moon in the passage we just read? Lesser light, but as if it is a light source that governs the night. Now, I know when I learned about the moon, essentially it's a giant rock, satellite. It doesn't give off any light of itself. It essentially reflects the light of the sun. But it's interesting the way that God describes it. Because I know for us, at least for myself, I don't think of the sun as a light, or even a lesser light. But is it? Think of it this way. When we have those moon cycles, when there's no moon in the sky, does it ever feel like something's missing? And I know that's very subjective, but this is kind of how I think of it. Does it ever feel like to any of you that something's missing when there's no moon, not even a sliver of it? Kind of feels empty. Hopefully I'm not out on a limb on that. And it's interesting to think that night, and the way that Randall and Lisa were saying that time is sort of defied, day and night or evening and morning are sort of codified and defined and really are given a sense of place, because we understand when the sun is out, it's day. When the moon is out, that light governing the night and bringing illumination. And a lot can be said, and I don't want to get just full on into speculation mode, but it is interesting that even in darkness, there is still a source of light. It's hard for me to think that that is unintentional. That God, do we really need, we'll go into why some of the benefits of the moon in a moment, but if we're just thinking about needing light at night, can we still sort of function in the dark without the moon? I mean, we have fire, now we have flashlights in a modern sense, but fire's been around, man can always make torches. Is there really a need for there to be a light source in the nighttime? It is comforting.
But you also, even when the moon isn't projecting light, but it's not cloudy, there's still constellations, stars, sunlight. It's not like in a cave that is completely absent of light or something.
That's a great point, and I'm glad you brought that up of the stars, even when the moon's not out, if it's clear and you don't live in the Central Valley in California, you can see the stars usually. That was one of the things I loved about living in Corscold was you always got the stars. Fresno, it was kind of a shot in the dark sometimes. But that's a great point, Don, is there is this sort of feeling of comfort because you can look up, even when the moon's not there, there's light, the light bringing comfort. But one of the things that I sort of think about is it's not, God could have made it to where the evening, the darkness, the nighttime, it was just an empty, dark sky. And we as man could have functioned more or less the same without it. Now, we won't go into the navigation and all that. So what it means to me is that there's an intentionality, sort of the comfort that Don was talking about, but also that there's a very real sense of, when the moon is out, when the stars are out, that there is still a light that glooms in the darkness. Even when there is majority night, that there's always some ray of light that is peeking through. And is that not true? Some fact for us that I think often gets lost is if we feel surrounded by metaphorical darkness, those that are more half cup full people say, well, there's always some bit of light. There's always some light that's going to pierce the darkness. We talk about that in the metaphoric sense with God. Even when we feel completely surrounded by darkness, we know that God is there, that Christ is there, that there's some light in that darkness, and our physical world reflects that. It's hard for me, some of you may disagree and think I am making far too much of a leap, but it's hard for me to not see that as intentional. That even in the night sky, there's still light to be found. Even when the whole sky is surrounded by darkness, there's still light out in the sky. Hard for me to think that that is unintentional, and the way that that reflects the spiritual sense of things. Does that make sense? Somewhat? Jessica, wow, my brain just really skipped there. Jessica, and then Lisa, and then Judy.
Kind of reaffirm what you already said. Human beings, we tend to be rather fearful, especially of the dark.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I think it's an instinctual fear. And having the sun and the moon and the stars at night is a comfort.
Mm-hmm.
It lets us know that we'll have a way to be able to still see. And that was before with the modern technology, before fire would have been discovered, they would have still had the stars. And then even in the deepest, darkest parts of the ocean, there are creatures that create light.
Yeah, no, that's a very good point, that there is light in the stars, how kind of what Don was saying, that it brings comfort, and that you even have this reflected by creatures in the deepest part of the ocean that create light, so that there's some sort of light in the deepest dark. That's a very interesting point. Lisa? Mm-hmm. Yeah. You look out in the dark sky and you see this big light and it reflects God's glory. I think that's a great point, and we can see that reflected in creation constantly, of looking and seeing, wow, God did this. It's a great point. Judy?
Well, the moon light is from the sun anyway, right?
Mm-hmm.
The sun light off the moon. Make it look like it has light. But anyway, the other thing is, two things, good for navigation, this day road, and then also for us, we need rest. We need it to be dark. So we have that, like Randall was saying, it's a sense of the time thing. We need to rest at a certain time of the day and be ready to go for the next.
That's a good point, too. It signals to our bodies that have internal clocks that it is time for rest. And then also, you and Jessica both brought up the navigation. that before we had Google Maps, me young, how you people that used maps, how'd you do that? And then even before that, you have the sailors that are navigating through the North Star. Even we look at the three wise men. How did they go to Jesus? How did they navigate to Christ? Star in the sky. So it's a great point as well. Any other comments or questions for Ian?
Sort of reflects the framework in which I read and understand Genesis, but the use of the language here is not describing, it's like a polemic against what ancients, especially pagans, thought the sun and the moon were. They frequently considered them deities.
Yes.
And instead, we see, well, these aren't deities, these were creations by the Almighty God.
Yeah.
And so instead of saying, well, the sun is whatever, like we read even in the Bible itself, it talks about how they worship the sun and the moon. Instead, right from the beginning, no, these were creations, gifts from God. That's how they came to be. These aren't entities that we need to worship. Instead, we need to worship the Creator as opposed to these creations.
That's an excellent point. To sort of build upon that, what Ian is saying, that it's a refutation against the very common pagan tendency to worship the sun and moon and to give them qualities of deities, that Genesis shows that they are clearly things that God makes, that they're gifts from God to help us live in this world. And to build upon that, remember Moses, this Genesis is being written in the time of Moses. Where did the Israelites, where did Moses just come from? Egypt. Two of the chief deities in Egypt is Ra, the sun god, is the primary deity in their pantheon. And they also have a deity for the moon that just escaped my brain, but they are both chief deities. And so when this is being given to the people of Israel, they are surrounded, and Jace came from a culture where the sun and the moon are deified, and here we have God giving the account of creation, directly refuting the ideas around the Israelites when they receive this from Moses, from the hand of Moses. That's a great point to look at this. And the reason that this is actually one of the more defined days is the sun and the moon, not just for all the benefits that they give our planet and humankind, but to show that these are God's creations. They are nothing more than stars, lights that God gives to govern the world. Nothing more and nothing less than that. Great point, Ian.
A lot of other times in those mythologies, they have it that the god of the sun and the moon are there first.
Yes, they're usually kind of the alpha and the omega in many ways.
And in this case, they're created fourth day. So it's not, they were like created later on. So it's in God's creations, they're not the things.
Yeah.
So that, and that's like in stark contrast to what all the other pagan religions had about the sun and the moon.
That's a great point, that the sun and the moon are given in the middle of creation. They're not even given the usual treatment in a lot of pantheons that they're the first and the last, or that they're very chief deities. No, these are, sun and moon is just the fourth day. It's right in the middle of it. It's a great point as well. I want to move on from that to talking about, again, some of the preciseness and the exactness that we look at with just the moon. Or actually, starting with the sun. So, the sun is a unique star. Now, we talk about, of course, stars are all suns and suns are stars. Or the sun is a star. They give off light. And there's a lot of different types. And not just to just think about this in a broad sense with the fourth day. We look up and we may see a few hundred stars, right? There's a lot of stars in the sky. Then we think of what man has discovered or really uncovered, I think is a better way to say it, is there are millions and millions, if not billions, of stars in our universe. There are millions of stars just in our galaxy, and we have found numerous different galaxies. We think of the sun as being, this big ball of fire, and that's just one. There are numerous out there in the world. And they fall under a bunch of different categories as well. Black dwarf, brown dwarf, red sun, yellow sun, so on and so forth. But the sun in our solar system is extremely unique. And science tells us why it's unique, because it is, just like with the atmosphere, perfectly tuned to the life on this planet. If the sun was bigger, it would create two things. One, probably more heat. Number two, it would create a greater gravitational pull, which would knock the Earth out of alignment as we move around the sun. And it would cause the exertion of gravity to be greater on the Earth, which would cause most of us, unless you drink lots of milk, I'm kidding, that the greater gravity would actually crush us, because our bones are not made to withstand it. We'd burn up because it'd be too hot. If the sun was in a different stage, say it was a dwarf, say it was a white dwarf or brown dwarf, wouldn't give off enough heat and we would all die. If the sun was smaller, we'd float off because there would not be enough gravity to keep us in orbit of the sun, and eventually we would float too far from the sun and we'd all freeze to death. All of this, and if you were in Dan's class on Tuesday, I believe this got brought up, there is an exacting preciseness, just like with the atmosphere. The sun is the perfect star for us. Now, how do you get that through chance? How do you get that through randomness? It's extremely improbable. Now let's talk about the moon. The moon is also perfect because anyone know, in the physical sense, besides giving off light, there's something that the moon does for the Earth. There's really two chief things that the moon does for the Earth. Anyone know what those might be? Nolan? Okay, it affects the ocean tides because of the gravity exerted upon the Earth. That's one. Anyone know the other one? It's a shield. So, you ever look at the pictures of the moon, or even if you grew up with silly cartoons like me, where it would show the moon in like a Looney Tunes cartoon, and it would look like Swiss cheese because it has all these craters in it. Or you look at a picture of the moon and you see all the craters. The reason there's craters in the moon is because a bunch of asteroids are constantly hitting the moon, or they're being driven off course by the moon's gravitational force. The moon is what protects the Earth from constantly being bombarded by asteroids and by comets. It takes a lot of the impacts. It also exudes enough gravity at its size to push things off course from hitting the Earth. There are always those sci-fi movies. If you were like me, you watch some of those silly sci-fi movies like Armageddon, the big one is going to come and hit the Earth. Well, one of the things they talk about in the movie is that it will have, if there's ever an asteroid that'll destroy the Earth, not even going to get into the fact that probably won't happen, because it's very predictable and observable and there's a lot of warning. But one of the things that even that silly Hollywood movie talks about is You have to have something of great enough size to get past the moon. The moon is our shield. If the moon was a little bit smaller, and I mean just a little, like 3% smaller, most of the carbon-based life on Earth would have been wiped out by very large asteroids a long time ago. If it was a little bit bigger, it would be too big for the sun's heat to reach the Earth and we would freeze. It's also in the perfect position. Nolan kind of brought this up, talking about the tides. Tides are controlled by the moon's closeness to the Earth. If the moon was closer to the Earth, the ocean tides would be in such chaos it would actually raise the water level and we would drown. There would be no more Earth. We'll talk about that concerning the flood later. If it was further away, we would actually have much lower tides. There would be less ocean on the Earth, and that would cause its own problems. It's in the perfect position. It's the perfect size. We don't get that through chance. And I know some of you are probably thinking, okay, Robert, we get it. But this is important to show to someone, look, how do you, okay, fine, you want to just, okay, yeah, the atmosphere is random. Plants coming after their own kind, the complexity of plant life, that's just random. Okay, what about the sun and stars? How do you get past that? How does one get past the fact that we are in a galaxy that is made up of millions of stars, and we are in one of the few points in the galaxy where we can sustain life? Because if we were in a different part of the galaxy, or we were in a different type of galaxy, that would create enough complications and difficulties, and you can look this up, that would make it impossible for life to be on this planet. Every time we look at God creating something else and looking how it reflects upon Earth, it's perfect. It is good. It is precise. It is without error. Because if there was error, we wouldn't be here. That's how precisely the knobs of creation are tuned and dialed by God. Any comments or questions before we move on to the next point? All right. So, we've talked about the fourth day. We mentioned, I want to very quickly mention verse 18, even though we talked about it a couple of weeks ago. And Randall and Lisa both brought this up, that God placed them in the expanse of the heavens to give light on the earth and to govern the day and the night, to separate the light from the darkness, and God saw that it was good. Sun, moon, they are how we as human beings tell time. It's how we understand the concept of time. We don't often talk about that when we talk about the sun and the moon, but they're what define our 24-hour cycle on this earth. A few hours of sunlight, then the moon, and the sun, and it's a continual, predictable cycle. Time has to be predictable because it is a precise measurement from one point to the next, right? Even if we want to call this, just pause for about 2 seconds. Okay, that is a definable point in time. 1/1000, 2/1000. Even if we don't want to call it a second, we want to call it a bleep bloop. I know that sounds silly, but it doesn't matter what we call it, because if we pause, 2 measurements of time has passed, however we call it. It's finite, it's precise, it's exact. There's no confusion. So when God makes the sun and the stars to govern time for us, to tell us day and night, to govern our seasons, that is just another example of the lack of confusion and the orderliness of creation. God is not an author of confusion, as we talked about last week. And if time was not precise and it was not, most importantly, consistent, we would be in utter confusion upon this world. Time is predictable. Seasons are predictable. Everything in our world that is governed by time is predictable because time was made to be precise. And it's not confusing. And that is a consistent thing we see that with everything God makes. All right, moving into the fifth day. Larry Enriquez, could I get you to read for me verses 20 through 23, please?
God said, let the waters swarm with swarms of living creatures, and let birds fly above the earth across the expanse of the heavens. So God created the great sea creatures and every living creature that moves with which the waters swarm, according to their kind, and every winged bird according to its kind. And God saw that it was good. And then God blessed them, saying, be fruitful and multiply and fill the waters in the sea, and let birds multiply on the earth. And there was evening and there was morning the fifth day.
Thank you. All right, so now we're in the day 5. We get to, what are the two things we see made on day 5?
Sea creatures and birds.
Sea creatures and birds. And is there any similarities that we see with the sea creatures and the birds that we see with plants? There we go. After their own kind. That same exactness, that same preciseness, that same order. Right? You're not going to have a bird and a fish and come out with a birdfish. Not going to happen. It is impossible because they are different kinds. I was going to save this, but I think we'll see if anyone brings that up. But either next week we'll touch on it if no one brings it up. But one of the things that I want us to think about with the animals here is there's a common theory that before any other life, that fish came first and then everything evolved or came after that. Do you think God that's an obvious answer. Why do you think then that God does not make birds at the same time that he makes everything else on the earth? Because he mentions birds dwell upon the earth, fish, of course, dwell in the sea, but why are they made at the same time then? And then, I want to be clear, there is no right or wrong answer here. I just want to think about this for a few moments. So what do you think, Ian?
I have an answer. I don't know if it's what you're going after, though. But I'll give it to you anyway. If you arrange the days of creation into 2 columns and you have day 1, 2, and 3 on the left side, and 4, 5, and 6 on the other side,
Mm-hmm.
you will see that there is a chiastic structure to it. Day 1 is talking about light being separated from darkness. What do we see in day 4 directly across? You see the greater and lesser lights being created.
Mm-hmm.
When you look at day 2, you see that it's separating the water from the sky. What do we see in day 5 directly across from number 2? You see birds and fish
Yep.
dwelling in their respective domains of the sky and the waters. Then in day 3, you see land being formed, vegetation, etc. Look directly across. Day 6, all land animals and man are created. That's my response to that.
Fair enough. And I think that makes logical sense.
And it's more, it has less to do with the physical
Yes.
mechanism of how creation made it and more to do with the poetic structure of the description of creation.
Yes. And we talked a lot about that with, the sort of alternative view of, looking at the day cycle of, the young earth creationism versus the old earth creationism. But I do think that even if someone like me who really strongly believes in, the young earth creation, there's still a consistent logic there. I think very little of the scripture is made unintentionally. That God reflects, day one, we have the cosmos. Day 4, you have the things that fill the things that fill the cosmos. Day 2, you have sort of the earth and the sky. And then day 5, you have the things that fill the sea and the sky. I said the earth and the sky, the waters and the sky. And then you have the things that fill that. And then day 3, you have the earth being created. And then day 6, you have the things that dwell upon the earth. Even if one doesn't take that as this is a sort of metaphorical poem, or that there's a sort of poetic presentation or language, it's still clear that there's something to be said about there's a reflection. God is showing, and it shows the intentionality. Can I say much more beyond that because I'm not God? No. But it is interesting, and I'm glad you kind of brought that up, Ian, because it is interesting at least to observe. But going back to the question that I asked before, and Ian did give an answer, it's just slightly different than the one in my head. So I want to ask the question again, why do you think we have sea creatures and air creatures, the birds and the fish, being created on the same day? Tidell?
One dominates the earth, the other one dominates the sea. He's filling both up.
Okay, that's an interesting way of looking at it. The fish, the sea creatures, they dominate the sea. Though the birds, while they dwell on the earth, they at least dominate the sky. I don't know if they necessarily dominate the earth, but that's an interesting point. Anyone else?
They'll both become food sources for the land creation.
That's an interesting point. They will both become food sources. I didn't think about that, to be honest, but that's a very interesting point. Mona?
I was reading about, and I interrupt scripture again, that all the food that was for the animals, whatever kind of animals that were created was to create plant life. So, the birds, birds do, they eat something and then they reseed the land.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe their function was to spread plant life and to maybe respiration of the water cycle. But I don't think the plants were there for all animals. There were no need. You can read what it said. All arrangements, all plants were for all the animals.
Mm-hmm.
So, maybe it was a time where things to provide a food source for the
Quite possibly. I've got a slightly different. Oh, go ahead, Jessica.
What Mona was saying is that it is kind of the beginnings of the building up the ecosystem, because birds and creatures of the sea are kind of dependent upon each other, whether the birds will see fish as a food source or vice versa, because there are some sharks that will eat birds if they get a chance. So it is the beginnings of making the ecosystem.
Yeah, that's something that if we think of it, if we were to kind of divide it the way the scripture does of land animals, sky animals, and sea creatures or sea animals, a lot of birds are extremely dependent upon sea animals, more than they are on land animals. And I think that's very interesting that you're bringing up, that they have a sort of co-equal existence, or sort of a symbiotic existence where they feed upon one another. And that kind of goes to my personal answer to that question, which is that God shows that these things came together so that if man begins to question and try and divorce one from the other, no, they were made at the same time. They came together. And knowing that man is going to try and create a hierarchy or a separation of which came first, God sort of throws a whole monkey wrench in that and says, oh, you want to say they all came from the sea? Well, what about the birds? They're in the air. They came at the same time. And they are equally necessary for life for each other. Can't divorce the two. I think it's really interesting when you look at it in those terms. Is that the answer? No, that's just my answer. And I think all of you have that have mentioned answers, I think, are very good and are just as equally as valid. But one of the last things that I'm going to tee this up for next week, to final thought. When we move into talking about the last steps of creation and the ones for us as man that is most relevant, being the creation of land animals and then humans, is when we look at the system of creation, is there room for an idea that these species propagate one after the other and that you have to move from one species into the next species into the next? Or is there room in God's creation for adaptation? If these creatures that are made here in creation are the same, each and every one are the same ones that we see now upon the earth, and if they have to be exactly as they were created, or if there's malleability. To put that in more simple terms, I realize I said that a little more complicated, did God create all of these different types of animals and even the plant life to be static and unadaptable to any climate, or if they were universally all made for one climate and one climate only and cannot change once they are created? Sit on that, think about that, and we're going to talk more about that. And some of you may know what I'm already hinting towards and what we're kind of laying the groundwork for. And we'll talk more about that next week when we get into day 6. 2 weeks in a row. We got 2 days done, 2 weeks in a row. Lord willing, we'll get through chapter 1 next week. And we will go into chapter 2 and chapter 3. With that being said, I will go ahead and close with a word of prayer. Let's see, who can I pick on? Bob French, would you mind leading us in the closing word of prayer? Or, sorry, not Bob. Richard Thomas. Hey, I'm sorry, Richard.
Sorry, I knew you were staring at me. I only have one blind eye. Our Holy Father in heaven, as we approach thy throne, we're so thankful for this another beautiful Lord's Day that we have. We're thankful for this opportunity to come and study another portion of thy word. We pray that the things that we've said are according to thy will, glorify thy name. We ask you to be with us as we leave this building and to be with us until we can meet again. Keep us safe. For in Christ's name we do pray. Amen.
Amen.